This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. The road turned to dirt 3 miles past the last mailbox. Gravel first, then loose stone the color of rust, then nothing but ruts carved into red Appalachian clay that sucked at the tires and painted the wheel wells orange. White oak and hickory pressed close from both sides, their branches reaching across the gap overhead until the canopy sealed shut and the afternoon light filtered down in scattered coins. Bright, then gone, then bright again across the hood of the pickup truck. The truck was a 2009 Silverado, gray where it wasn't rusted. West Virginia plates that didn't belong to the man behind the wheel, purchased off a retired electrician in Parkersburg 2 months ago for cash and never discussed again. No bumper stickers, no decals, nothing on the dashboard except a folded envelope from a law office in Charleston and a photograph turned face down against the vinyl. In the passenger seat, a German shepherd sat upright, with his ears tilted forward and his body still. Gunner. 6 years old, 82 pounds, black and tan with a working frame that hadn't softened since the day he'd walked out of the kennels at Camp Lejeune for the last time. His coat rippled in the warm air coming through the cracked window, but the rest of him held motionless, locked onto something beyond the windshield that the man driving couldn't see yet. Easy. The dog didn't turn. The farm appeared all at once through a gap in the trees. No gradual reveal, just sudden open sky and a cleared slope where the forest pulled back. A 2-story house sat at the base of a gentle slope, its wood siding stripped by weather to a pale silver, paint curling away from the clapboard in long ribbons. A covered porch wrapped around the front, sagging on the left side where a support post had shifted in the clay. Boxwood hedges, untrimmed and aggressive, pressed against the foundation like they were trying to push the house back into the hillside. Behind the house, 50 yards up the slope, a barn, large. Gray timber darkened by decades of rain. A tin roof gone the color of pewter. Double doors shut tight, one of them hanging an inch open at the bottom where the frame had warped. Colton Voss killed the engine. The silence that replaced it was total. No traffic, no machinery, no human sound at all. Just wind through high branches and, somewhere distant, a creek running over stone. He looked at the envelope on the dash. Sole beneficiary, Evelyn Voss. Property and contents thereof. He'd driven 11 hours to sign papers, meet the lawyer in town, and put a for sale sign in the yard. 1 day, maybe 2. Then back to the road, back to the truck, back to the slow drift south toward nothing in particular. That was the plan. Clean. Simple. Done. The passenger door swung open. Gunner had nosed the latch, a trick he'd learned in the canine compound, back when tricks meant the difference between a locked room and an open one, and dropped to the ground before Colton could reach across the seat. The dog did not go to the house. He did not sniff the perimeter of the truck, or investigate the overgrown yard, or check the tree line, or do any of the dozen things that 6 years of routine and 3 combat deployments had built into his bones. Instead, he ran. Ears flat, body low, straight up the slope past the dead herb garden and the rusted wheelbarrow and the collapsed section of wire fence, straight to the barn. He squeezed through the gap in the double doors and vanished inside. "Gunner, here!" The command echoed off the hillside. Nothing came back. No bark, no scratch of nails on wood, no sound at all from inside the barn. Colton stepped out of the truck. His boots hit clay, and the ground gave slightly under his weight. He stood beside the Silverado and scanned the property. Perimeter first, anomalies second, threat assessment third. 16 years in force reconnaissance had built that sequence into his nervous system. The padlock on the barn doors was brass, new. The hasp it hung from was old iron, but the lock itself had clean edges, no patina, no weather stain. Someone had replaced it within the last year. The grass between the house and the barn had been walked on, not mowed, pressed flat in a narrow trail, like someone had made the trip between those two buildings many times over many months. The front door of the house had a standard deadbolt. The barn had the better lock. He climbed the slope. The barn doors groaned when he pulled them wider, and light fell in a long rectangle across the dirt floor. Hay bales stacked 3 high against the far wall, their twine gone brittle and dark. A wooden workbench beneath a window, so caked with grime that the sun behind it registered only as a gray smear. Farm tools on wall pegs, a hoe, a mattock, a pair of shears with wooden handles, a wheelbarrow overturned in one corner. Everything coated in fine gray dust, the kind that accumulates not in weeks, but in years. And there, in the far corner, where the light from the open doors couldn't reach, Gunner sat. He was not alert. He was not tracking. His nose was not working the air, and his ears were not pivoting toward sound. He sat in front of an old pine table, pushed against the stone foundation wall, and he was looking at the empty space above it. His body was completely still. His breathing was slow and even. His tail rested flat on the dirt floor. He sat the way a dog sits in a room where someone familiar is present, relaxed, attentive, patient, as though he were waiting for a hand to reach down and touch the top of his head, as though whoever usually sat at that table had only stepped out for a moment and would return. But no one was sitting at that table. No one had sat there in 3 months. The chair was pushed in. The surface was layered with dust. Gunner. The dog's tail swept the dirt once, then stopped. His eyes didn't move. Colton crossed the barn slowly. His boots left clear prints in the dust, the only fresh marks on the floor. He crouched beside the dog, one knee down, and followed his gaze. The table was scarred pine, its surface cross-hatched with decades of use. A circular ring marked the center, where a lamp or a jar had stood in the same spot for so long it had stained the grain. Scratches radiated out from the center, the tracks of a pen pressing through paper onto wood, years and years of writing. Near the far edge, carved small and deliberate into the pine, a single letter. E. "What do you see, boy?" Gunner didn't look at him. He was watching the chair, watching the space above the chair, watching whatever it was that existed in that corner of the barn that Colton's eyes couldn't find and his dogs wouldn't leave. The barn was quiet. The dust floated in the light from the open door. The letter E sat in the wood grain like a signature that had outlasted the hand that carved it. The house smelled like dried lavender and old paper. Not the chemical sweetness of air freshener. The faded, stubborn scent of herb sachets hung in closets years ago, their fragrance thinned to almost nothing, but refusing to disappear entirely. Colton left the front door open behind him and stood in the parlor, letting his eyes adjust to the interior light. A couch against one wall, draped in a quilt whose pattern had washed out to soft blues and grays. A rocking chair near the window, its seat cushion compressed to the exact contour of someone who had used it every evening for decades. A cast-iron wood stove in the corner, cold, its pipe rising through the ceiling. Everything was in its place. Nothing had been disturbed. The house didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. He moved through the rooms, hands in his jacket pockets. The kitchen was small and immaculate. Cast-iron sink, a table built for two, though only one chair showed where, a propane stove with a kettle still on the burner. On the wall above the stove, mounted on a single nail, a wooden cross. Handmade. The crossbeam slightly shorter than it should have been, as if the carpenter had run out of material and decided close enough was good enough. He noticed it, filed it away, kept moving. The hallway ran from the kitchen to the front staircase, and both walls were lined with framed photographs. Colton passed the first two without stopping. Landscapes, a younger version of the house, a dog he didn't recognize. The third photograph stopped him. A woman in her mid-30s stood in front of a brick building with tall institutional windows. She wore a white lab coat buttoned to the collar, and she held a clipboard against her hip. Behind her, partially visible beyond her right shoulder, a sign with brass lettering. The first two letters U.S., and then the rest obscured. She looked directly into the camera. She was not smiling. She was not performing for the lens. She looked like someone who had been interrupted from work that mattered and wanted to get back to it. Colton studied the photograph. He had met his grandmother 4 times in 42 years. The last visit, he was 12. His mother had driven him up from Norfolk during a summer leave, and Evelyn Voss had walked him through the herb garden behind the house. Rows of plants he couldn't name, stalks and leaves she touched with more tenderness than most people reserved for family photographs. She'd spoken to him as though he were an adult, which had confused him. "This land knows how to keep a secret, Colton. Most people don't have the patience to listen." He'd thought she was strange. A recluse who grew weeds and lived on a mountain with a dog named Sergeant and didn't own a television. His mother had said very little on the drive home, and they'd never gone back. He looked at the photo again. The lab coat, the government building, the expression of a woman with work to do. From outside, through the open back door, he could hear the barn, specifically the absence of sound from inside it. Gunnar was still in there, still sitting in the dark. Colton pulled his wallet from his back pocket. Tucked into the leather fold behind his driver's license was a photograph the size of a playing card, its edges soft from being handled. Elise. Taken at Virginia Beach the summer before the diagnosis. brown hair across her shoulders, freckles, laughing at something he'd said, though he couldn't remember what it was. He looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. Then he slid it back into the wallet, and the wallet back into his pocket. 2 women he'd lost. One he'd married. One he'd barely known. Both of them had been keeping things from him. He turned back to the kitchen. On the table, half buried beneath a stack of junk mail that the estate lawyer must have collected from the box at the road, sat an envelope, cream-colored, sealed with care. The handwriting on the front was careful, slightly slanted, the kind of penmanship they used to teach in schools that no longer existed. For whoever comes last. Colton picked it up. The envelope weighed almost nothing. He opened it with his thumbnail and slid out a single sheet of paper. A hand-drawn map of the property. The house was marked with a small square and labeled House in block letters. The herb garden with a circle and the word Garden. The creek along the eastern edge with a wavy line. And the barn, marked with an X, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly punched through to the other side. Beneath the X, in smaller handwriting, "Start here." He looked through the back door. The barn sat gray and still against the ridge, its tin roof catching the last of the afternoon sun. Inside, somewhere in the dark, his dog was still sitting beside a table, watching an empty chair, waiting for someone who was never coming back. Or waiting for someone who just had. Morning light came through the barn at an angle that turned the floating dust into a slow, golden drift. Colton stood at the open doors with a gas station coffee in his hand and watched the light crawl across the floor toward the far corner. He'd slept in the truck again. The house had beds and clean sheets and a wood stove he could have lit. But beds meant settling in, and he wasn't settling in. He was here to sell a property, not to sleep in a dead woman's bedroom. Gunnar was inside the barn. Same corner, same table. But this morning, the dog was not sitting still. He was scratching at the floor. Not the loose, scattered scratching of a dog who'd caught a rodent scent or was bored and digging at nothing. This was targeted, mechanical. His right forepaw dragged across the same 6-inch section of floorboard, over and over, his nails catching in the grain and pulling back with a rhythmic scrape. His head was low, his ears were forward. His entire body was oriented toward one point on the floor, like a compass needle locked onto north. Colton set the coffee on the workbench and crossed the barn. He crouched beside the table and looked at the floor where Gunnar was working. The boards were old white oak, wide planks, dark with age, their surface worn smooth by years of boots and weather and use. But the section directly beneath the table was different. He ran his fingers along the grain. The color was close, almost right. In poor light, most people would never notice. But the grain ran perpendicular to the surrounding planks, and the nails were Phillips head screws countersunk into the wood, not the square-cut iron nails that held the rest of the floor together. 16 years in force recon. 5 deployments to places where the difference between a rock and a buried pressure plate was a shadow that didn't match the sun angle. Notice what doesn't fit. Everything is information. "Somebody replace these boards." Gunnar paused. He looked at Colton. Then he looked at the floor. Then back at Colton. "Yeah, I see it." He found the pry bar in the hall closet of the house. Old steel, solid. The handle wrapped in duct tape that had gone stiff with age. Back in the barn, Gunnar had stopped scratching and was sitting beside the spot, still and focused. His posture that of a dog at the end of a track. Alert, certain, indicating. Colton wedged the bar beneath the first plank, pushed. The screw resisted, bit into the wood, and then the board cracked free with a sound that rang off the tin roof like a gunshot. He pulled it aside. Then the next. Then the third. Beneath the oak, a second layer of wood. Plywood, painted dark to match, and set into its center a recessed metal ring the size of a man's fist. Colton hooked the pry bar through the ring and pulled. The panel lifted on concealed hinges, swinging up smoothly, releasing a breath of cool air that carried the smell of stone and damp earth and something faintly chemical. Not unpleasant, just old, just hidden. Stone steps, narrow, cut into the native rock, descending into black. Gunnar went first. He didn't wait for a command. He didn't hesitate at the top or test the first step with his paw. He descended into the dark as though the stone stairway were a building in Helmand province. Low, controlled, ears rotating, paws silent on the stone, and disappeared before Colton could say a word. Colton pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and followed. The cellar was roughly 15 by 20 feet, carved from the limestone bedrock that formed the spine of the ridge. The walls were natural stone, unfinished, sweating faintly with groundwater. Someone had poured a thin concrete floor over the original earth, and on that floor they had built a workspace. A long wooden bench ran the length of one wall, its surface scarred and stained by years of use. Above the bench, shelves, 3 rows, floor to ceiling, holding dozens of glass jars. Each jar was hand-labeled in the same careful, slanted handwriting from the envelope upstairs. Dried specimens inside. Cross-sectioned mushrooms, pressed root systems, bark shavings, leaf samples sealed in wax. A compound microscope sat on the bench beside a rack of glass slides, and next to that, a stack of composition notebooks held together with a rubber band that had long since lost its stretch. Against the far wall, a steel cabinet, padlocked. Old, but solid. The kind of institutional furniture that survived decades because no one bothered to replace it. And sitting in front of that cabinet, perfectly still, was Gunnar. His right front paw was raised, held in the air for a long moment, then placed, gently and deliberately, on the face of the cabinet. Not scratching, not pawing, pointing. The same behavior he'd been trained to perform when he located a target during a search. The calm, certain indication that said, "Here, this is what you're looking for." "I see it, buddy. Fuss." The dog didn't move. His eyes stayed on the cabinet. His body said what his mouth couldn't. "Open this." Colton reached for the notebook on top of the stack. The leather cover was cracked and soft from years of handling, its spine broken at several points where the pages had been opened to the same sections again and again. He opened it to the first page. Evelyn Voss. Research notes. Year 23. The handwriting matched the map, matched the envelope, matched the photograph caption he'd seen in the hallway. He flipped forward, pages dense with data, growth rates charted in pencil, soil pH logged in columns, temperature readings tracked over months, chemical notations he didn't understand, diagrams of fungal structures drawn with a precision that suggested formal training, not hobby sketching. And threaded between the data, in a different ink, personal entries written in the margins. They offered again today. I was polite. I said no. They were polite back. But politeness has a weight to it when it comes from men in suits who drive cars that cost more than your house. Another page. Years later, the ink darker, the handwriting tighter. The second visit was not friendly. He did not threaten me directly. He did not need to. I will not write his name here, but I remember his face, and so does Sargent. The last entry. The handwriting shook. The letters leaned hard to the right, as if the hand writing them was being pulled somewhere else. If anyone finds this, do not sell. What I've grown here is not mine alone. It belongs to the soil that made it and the people who need it. The proof is in the iron box. The key is where he always buried his treasures. Colton closed the notebook. He held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it. Not physical weight, but the accumulated pressure of decades pressed between cardboard covers. 23 years of research. 23 years of someone sitting at that pine table upstairs, writing by lamplight, while the world forgot she existed. He looked at the cabinet. He looked at Gunnar, still pointing, still waiting. Okay. Let's find the key. The town of Laurel Hollow occupied a crease between two ridges where a creek had carved enough flat ground for a quarter-mile of pavement and a handful of buildings that hadn't changed in 40 years. A diner with a tin awning and condensation on the glass. A post office the size of a two-car garage. A volunteer fire station with a single engine parked in the open bay. A hardware store that was only open 4 days a week, according to the hand-lettered sign in its window. And at the far end of the main street, between a boarded-up laundromat and a stone church with a cracked bell tower, a narrow storefront with hand-painted letters on the glass. Hargrove Apothecary. Colton parked the Silverado outside the diner and sat behind the wheel for a moment, reading the town through the windshield. 900 people, according to the sign at the town limit, though that number had the look of something painted a long time ago and never corrected, downward. The buildings were maintained but tired. The sidewalks were clean but empty. A man in faded overalls sat on a bench outside the hardware store, watching the unfamiliar truck with the neutral, steady attention of someone who noticed everything and commented on nothing. Colton's right shoulder ached. It always ached after a night in the truck, the rotator cuff grinding where it had torn and scarred over. Too many 80-pound packs humped too many miles through mountains not so different from these. He needed bandage tape, ibuprofen, Maybe a tube of something topical he could work into the joint before it locked up on him entirely. He left Gunnar in the truck with the windows cracked and walked to the apothecary. Inside, the air smelled like dried rosemary and beeswax. Shelves lined both walls, stacked with amber bottles, hand-labeled tinctures, bundles of sage and yarrow hanging from the ceiling beams. A glass display case near the register held salves and balms in small tins. It was the kind of store that survived not on volume, but on trust. People came here because the woman behind the counter knew what she was doing. That woman had her back to the door when he walked in. She was measuring dried chamomile into a glass jar on a postal scale, her hands moving with practiced speed. "Be right with you." She turned. Mid-30s, chestnut hair tied low at the nape of her neck, a few strands loose along her temple. Flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, reading glasses pushed up on her head. Her hands were stained faintly green at the fingertips. Chlorophyll, herb work, the residue of someone who handled plants all day and didn't bother to scrub the evidence. Bandage tape, and whatever you carry for joint inflammation that doesn't need a prescription. She set the jar on the counter and studied him. Not suspicious, thorough. The way a pharmacist looks at someone before deciding what to recommend. "You're the one who drove up to Evelyn's place." News travels. 900 people. One road in and out. Truck like yours stands out. She reached beneath the counter and produced a roll of elastic tape and a small, unlabeled bottle. "Arnica salve, not a prescription. Evelyn used to buy the raw flowers from me and make her own." Colton took the tape, turned the bottle over in his hands. "What do I owe you?" "You are Colton." His jaw tightened. The muscles along his neck pulled taut and then released, deliberately, the way a man does when he's trained himself not to react to things that catch him off guard. "She didn't know me." "She knew enough. She talked about you more than you'd think. The grandson who joined the Marines. The one who—" Nola stopped herself, recalibrated. "She was proud of you. That's all." "I'm here to sell the property. That's it." Something shifted in Nola's expression. Not disappointment, more like recognition, as if she'd expected that answer and had already prepared for it. "If that's what you want." He paid cash, took the bag, turned for the door. Outside, Gunnar had his front paws on the tailgate, his head above the truck bed rail, watching the apothecary entrance through the afternoon light. When Nola stepped out behind Colton to adjust the "open" sign on her door, the dog jumped down from the truck. He walked past Colton without a glance, straight to Nola. He stopped in front of her, sat, and bumped his nose against her open palm. One firm nudge. Then he waited. Nola looked down. She didn't pull back or startle or do any of the things most people did when 82 pounds of German Shepherd appeared in front of them uninvited. She let her fingers rest on the bridge of his muzzle, then moved them to the top of his head. "Well, hello." Gunnar's tail swept the sidewalk once. Then he stood, returned to Colton's side, and sat again, as if the introduction had been completed to his satisfaction, and he had no further business with the woman at this time. Colton looked at the dog, looked at Nola. He doesn't do that. He just did. He opened the truck door. Gunnar jumped into the passenger seat and assumed his usual position, upright, forward-facing, ears at half-mast. You said she talked about me. Did she talk about the farm? About what she was working on up there? Nola leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms. The afternoon light caught the green stain on her fingers and the fine lines around her eyes that came from squinting at labels and measuring scales. Evelyn was the smartest person in this hollow. People didn't know what to do with that. She paused. She was working on something for a long time. She never told me exactly what, but she bought lab supplies through me. pH strips, borax, glass jars. More than a gardener would need. Did anyone else ask about it? If you're selling, you should know. Someone's been asking about that land for years, even before she died. Through lawyers, very polite. She paused again, and when she spoke next, her voice carried the careful weight of someone choosing their words precisely. People around here get nervous when outsiders are very polite. Colton held her gaze for a beat longer than casual, then climbed into the truck and pulled the door shut. The engine turned over, rough and familiar, and he backed out onto the main street. In the passenger seat, Gunnar faced forward, calm, his body carrying the quiet recalibration of a dog who had decided this place was worth paying attention to. The afternoon light had turned from gold to amber by the time the sedan appeared on the dirt road. Colton was standing on the porch, not sitting, one boot up on the bottom rail, his forearms resting on the top. He'd spent the last 2 hours replacing the broken window glass on the ground floor with plywood from the barn, and wrestling with the water pump under the house, which had seized from disuse and surrendered only after he'd taken it apart, cleaned the impeller, and reassembled it with hands that remembered mechanical work, and field stripping a weapon in equal measure, automatically, without consultation from the brain. Gunnar lay at the top of the porch steps, head on his front paws, watching the road. When the sedan appeared through the tree line, the dog's head came up. His ears rotated forward. His body didn't tense, but it organized. The subtle shift from rest to readiness that happened below the threshold of visible movement. The sedan was silver, clean, rental plates. It stopped 20 yards from the porch, and a man stepped out. Late 40s. Charcoal suit that had not been purchased within 200 miles of Laurel Hollow. Silver tie. Polished shoes that would not survive the walk from the car to the porch without damage. He carried a leather briefcase in his left hand and moved with the specific confidence of a man who expected his time to be valued. Mr. Voss? Colton didn't change his position on the rail. Who's asking? The man smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced, warm, expensive. The kind of smile that had been refined in conference rooms and practiced in mirrors and deployed at exactly this distance to convey approachability. Gerald Pratt, Vantage Biopharma Holdings, Regional Development. He held out a business card between 2 fingers. Colton looked at the card, didn't take it. Looked at the man. Looked at the road behind him for a second vehicle. Then back at the man. Long drive for a cold call. We tried reaching you through the estate attorney. No response. Pratt lowered the card and placed it on the porch rail as if leaving a tip. I thought a personal visit might be more productive. He looked past Colton at the house, the barn up the slope, the overgrown yard. His eyes moved with the quick, appraising sweep of someone who evaluated properties for a living. Vantage would like to acquire this parcel. $380,000. He opened the briefcase on the hood of his rental and produced a stapled document, heavy stock, cover letter on top. That's well above market rate for a property in this condition. $380,000. For a farm, the county assessor had valued at $120 on its best day. Colton did the math without moving his face. Gunnar stood. The motion was slow, unhurried, deliberate. The way large dogs move when they want you to see every pound of them. He stepped off the porch and positioned himself between Colton and the visitor, his body broadside, his head turned just enough to watch Pratt's hands without losing sight of his face. He didn't growl. The silence was more effective. Generous offer. Colton's voice was flat, unimpressed. What's the catch? No catch. Vantage sees long-term potential in these mountains. Botanical research, natural resource development. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She understood the value of this land even when others didn't. Colton's hands, resting on the porch rail, went still. Not tense. Still. The particular stillness of a man whose body has been trained to stop broadcasting before the mind decides what to do next. How much do you know about my grandmother? We research thoroughly, Mr. Voss. We believe in understanding the history of the properties we acquire. And the people who own them? And the people. The silence stretched. Wind moved through the oak canopy overhead. A bird called from somewhere up the ridge and received no answer. Pratt shifted his weight from one polished shoe to the other, a small, involuntary movement that told Colton everything he needed to know about the man's comfort with quiet. Then Pratt spoke again, and the temperature on the porch dropped. Moving around the way you have, that can't be easy, especially after losing someone. Elise, wasn't it? Cancer is a terrible way to go. The air on the porch changed. Colton's body didn't tense. It did the opposite. The muscles in his shoulders released. His hands opened at his sides, fingers loose. His breathing stayed even. From the outside, he looked calmer than he had at any point during the conversation. But his eyes shifted, locked onto Pratt with a focus that had nothing to do with real estate, nothing to do with business cards, nothing to do with offers on thick paper stock. How do you know that name? Not a question, a coordinate. Pratt's smile held, but the warmth drained from it. As I said, we research. Get off my property. Mr. Voss, this is a very competitive. Colton took one step forward. One. His right hand dropped to his side. Gunnar's ears flattened against his skull, and a sound rose from somewhere deep in the dog's chest. Low, constant, a frequency that lived between warning and certainty. Now! Pratt closed the briefcase, picked up his card from the rail, and put it in his breast pocket. Walked back to the sedan at a pace that wanted to be dignified and couldn't quite get there. The door shut. The engine started. The tires crunched on gravel, and the silver car reversed down the dirt road and disappeared into the trees. Colton stood on the porch and listened to the engine fade until there was nothing left of it but birdsong and wind. Then he walked around the north side of the barn, slowly, eyes on the ground. In the soft earth where rainwater drained off the tin roof, he found them. Boot prints. Not dress shoes, heavy treads, deep impressions. Work boots. The kind someone wears when they plan to walk through mud and don't want to leave tracks that match the shoes they wore to the front door. The prints circled the barn, paused near the double doors, then continued around to the back and stopped at the window. Someone else had been here. Recently. Someone who was not Gerald Pratt. Colton went inside the house, sat down at the kitchen table, placed his palms flat on the wood, and stared at the wall opposite. Gunnar followed him in through the back door, crossed the kitchen floor, and pressed his chin onto Colton's thigh. The dog's brown eyes turned upward, steady, reading. They said her name, buddy. They said her name. His voice was quiet, controlled, not broken and not angry. Somewhere past both of those things, in a place that had no name and didn't need one. The oak tree stood at the bottom of the slope behind the barn, its trunk wide enough that two men with outstretched arms couldn't have circled it. Wild grapevines spiraled up through the lower branches, thick as woven rope, blocking the light below and creating a canopy within a canopy. The ground beneath the tree was bare, packed hard by shade and the slow work of roots that had been gripping this hillside longer than anyone alive could remember. Colton stood at the base of the trunk and read the notebook entry again. He'd brought it with him from the cellar, tucked inside his jacket next to the photograph he kept face down. The key is where he always buried his treasures. He. She had written he. Not I, not we. He. Evelyn Voss had lived alone on this ridge for 30 years. No husband, no children nearby, no close neighbors. Only the dogs. Always German shepherds. Always named after military ranks. Sergeant, then colonel, then major. 3 dogs across 3 decades, each one living out its years in this barn and this yard and these woods, where he buried his treasures. Gunnar was already at the tree, not circling it, not sniffing the trunk, not investigating. He'd gone directly to a spot between 2 exposed roots on the east-facing side and started digging. Front paws driving into the packed earth, clods of red clay spraying out behind him, his body low and focused, his breathing hard through his nose. Colton crouched beside him. Easy, take it easy. The dog did not take it easy. His nails scraped against something solid. He pulled his head back, nosed into the hole, and clamped his jaws around a small box, wood, rotted at the corners, held together by rusted hinges and not much else. He dragged it free from the earth, backed up 2 steps, and set it at Colton's feet. Then he sat, looked up, waited. Good boy. Real good boy. Colton picked up the box. The wood crumbled where his fingers gripped it, but the contents were whole. A single iron key, heavy for its size, black with age, its teeth still sharp and precise. He looked at the dog, Gunnar looked at the barn, then at the hill, then back at Colton, with an expression that required no translation. We both know where this goes. The cabinet in the cellar opened on the first try. The lock was old, but someone had oiled it, recently enough that the mechanism turned without resistance. Inside, stacked neatly and wrapped in clear plastic sheeting to protect against the damp, a manila folder thick with documents, a patent application bound with a metal clip, and a letter on official stationery, its envelope still attached. Colton spread the documents across the workbench. His phone flashlight threw a cold white circle over the papers, harsh against the dim cellar stone. The folder was from the Appalachian Botanical Research Division, United States Department of Agriculture. The name on the cover page was Dr. Evelyn Voss, Senior Research Botanist. Service record, 14 years. Specialization, endemic fungal compounds with anti-inflammatory properties. The patent application ran 62 pages. Data tables, methodology sections, referenced studies, controlled experiments with replicated results. Colton couldn't follow the chemistry, but he could recognize rigor when he saw it. The same discipline that showed in the notebooks upstairs. The same precision that built this cellar and labeled every jar on the shelf. Stamped across the cover page in red ink, administratively declined. Review board recommendation. He turned to the back of the folder. A single sheet. The review board roster. 7 names, typed neatly, each with a title and institutional affiliation. Most of them meant nothing. The 4th name landed like a rifle crack in the silence of the cellar. Mercer Callahan, External Reviewer. Vantage Biopharma Holdings. The man who had sat on the review board that rejected Evelyn Voss's patent 15 years ago now worked for the company that had sent Gerald Pratt up this mountain with a briefcase full of money and his dead wife's name on his tongue. Colton set the paper down. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. The cellar was cold and still, and somewhere above him, through 15 feet of stone and oak and silence, the Appalachian sun was setting over the ridge. She didn't lose this fight. She took it underground. Gunnar stood beside the workbench, his posture erect, his eyes tracking between the documents and Colton's face and the stone stairway behind them, mapping the room, processing the change, doing what a working dog does when the mission shifts from search to something else entirely. Above them, the barn sat in the fading light. Below them, 30 years of buried truth waited to be read. And between those two places, a man and a dog stood still in the dark, recalibrating. Nola Hargrove's kitchen table was smaller than the one at the farm, but it held more. Herb samples in labeled bags covered half the surface. A mortar and pestle sat near the edge, its bowl stained green-black from years of grinding. A laptop, old but functional, was open to a database Colton didn't recognize. Columns of Latin names and molecular structures that looked like geometry problems drawn by someone who'd lost their ruler. The notebook lay between them, open to the middle section. Nola had been reading for 20 minutes. She hadn't spoken in the last 10. Colton sat across from her with his back to the wall and his chair angled toward the door. Gunnar lay under the table, his chin resting on the floor between his front paws, his eyes half open and tracking between the 2 humans above him. Every few minutes, the dog's ears rotated toward a sound outside. A truck passing, a screen door slamming somewhere down the street. And then came back. Nola turned a page, then another. Then she stopped, and her fingers pressed flat against the paper. This isn't what I thought it was. What did you think it was? I thought it was folk medicine. Careful folk medicine. Documented folk medicine. But still. She shook her head. The reading glasses had migrated from the top of her head to the bridge of her nose, and she pushed them up with the back of her wrist. This is a formal research protocol. Growth medium composition, controlled variables, replicated trials across multiple seasons. She was running a longitudinal study on an endemic Appalachian fungal compound, a specific mycelium that colonizes decaying hardwood root systems in high elevation soil. In English, a mushroom. A very specific mushroom that only grows up here, in this soil, at this altitude. She spent 20 years documenting its anti-inflammatory properties. Nola tapped the notebook. This data, if the compound behaves the way she recorded, it's stronger than most prescription anti-inflammatories on the market. And it's naturally occurring. No synthetic process. No patent-protected manufacturing. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, with something Colton recognized from a different life. The focused intensity of someone who had just realized they were holding something that mattered far more than they'd assumed. How much is that worth? If the compound can be validated and scaled, tens of millions, maybe more. She paused. But that's not what matters. What matters is what she was trying to do with it. Look. She turned to a section near the back of the notebook. The handwriting here was different. Less data, more narrative. Evelyn had written about the people she'd treated informally over the years. A neighbor with rheumatoid arthritis who'd stopped needing a cane after 3 months. A former miner whose chronic back inflammation had eased to the point where he could sleep through the night. A woman in the next hollow whose hands had been too swollen to hold a pen, until they weren't. She wasn't trying to make money. She was trying to prove it worked, so someone would listen. Under the table, Gunnar lifted his head. He looked at Nola, then tilted his head slightly to the right. One ear up, one relaxed. The posture of a dog encountering a new sound or concept and filing it for later reference. Your dog is paying attention. He does that when someone says something that matters. Nola closed the notebook carefully, aligning its spine with the edge of the table. Her hands lingered on the cover for a moment. Then she pulled them back and folded them in her lap. My mother grew these same plants. In her garden, 2 miles from here. Golden seal, ginseng, black cohosh, reishi. She used them for everything. Headaches, joint pain, stomach trouble. I was 12, and I thought it was superstition. I got my pharmacy degree so I could do things the right way, the scientific way. Then she got sick, and nothing I'd learned could help her. Nothing from the scientific way. She looked at the notebook. I came back too late. But your grandmother was here the whole time, doing what my mother did. Except she had the training to prove it. The room was quiet. Afternoon light fell through the kitchen window and caught the dust motes above the table, turning them into slow constellations. Nola, who's trying to buy the land? I don't have a name. The lawyers were out of Charleston. But whoever it is, they've been at it for at least 5 years. Every property on the North Ridge has gotten an offer. Most people sold. My grandmother didn't. No, she didn't. The county records office occupied the second floor of the Laurel Hollow Municipal Building, a brick structure that also contained the post office, the county clerk, and a single-stall restroom with a hand-lettered out-of-order sign that looked permanent. The stairway was narrow, the carpet worn through to the subfloor, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the particular desperation of bulbs that should have been replaced a decade ago. Nola led. Colton followed. Gunner stayed in the truck, ears tracking them through the open window until they disappeared inside. The records clerk was a woman in her 60s, with bifocals and a cardigan and the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had watched the same filing cabinets rust in the same room for 30 years. She looked at Nola, then at Colton, then at the folder Nola set on the counter. We need to pull property transfer records for the North Ridge. Last 15 years. And any patent filings associated with federal agricultural research conducted in this county. The clerk adjusted her glasses. That's specific. It needs to be. 2 hours. That was how long it took. The clerk pulled boxes from the back room. Nola cross-referenced names and dates. Colton sat at a table near the window and read each document as it surfaced, his fingers moving across the text the way they'd once moved across terrain maps in a briefing room. Methodical, looking for the pattern that didn't fit. The pattern emerged at 11:40 in the morning. Evelyn Voss had filed her patent application with the U.S. Patent Office on March 14, 2009. The application had been routed to an internal review board within the USDA's Botanical Research Division. On June 2, 2009, the review board had recommended administrative rejection, citing insufficient evidence of commercial viability. The patent was dead within 90 days. On the rejection board, Mercer Callahan, external reviewer, affiliated with Vantage Biopharma Holdings. Then the second document. A patent filing by Vantage Biopharma, dated November 8, 2012, 3 years after Evelyn's rejection. The filing described a botanical compound derived from endemic Appalachian fungi with documented anti-inflammatory properties. The methodology section read like a paraphrase of Evelyn's notebook, stripped of her name and rewritten in corporate language. Nola set the 2 documents side by side on the table. The original application, the corporate filing. The data was not identical, but the architecture was unmistakable. The same compound, the same growth medium, the same elevation range, the same results. They didn't just reject her, Nola said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. They took her research, rewrote it, and filed their own patent. Colton stared at the documents. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Outside the window, the main street of Laurel Hollow sat quiet under a late morning sun. And somewhere down that street, a dog waited in a truck with his ears pointed at a building he couldn't enter. The memory arrived without invitation. He was 14. Kitchen table in Norfolk. His mother washing dishes with the radio on low. He'd asked about Grandma Evelyn, why they never visited, why no one talked about her. His mother had turned the water off, but didn't face him. Her shoulders were tight, her voice careful. She fought the government, Colton, over some plants. Some research they told her wasn't worth funding. She wouldn't let it go, and they took everything. Her position, her pension, her reputation. She moved to that mountain and never came back down. Don't be like her, his mother had said. Not cruel, tired. The exhaustion of a woman who had watched her own mother sacrifice a life for a principle and hadn't decided yet whether that made her brave or foolish. Some fights aren't worth winning. The fluorescent light buzzed. The clerk was filing something in the back. Nola was watching him. Colton? He looked at the patent documents, the corporate filing, the stolen methodology. His grandmother hadn't been a hermit. She hadn't been eccentric or difficult or paranoid. She'd been a scientist who had done rigorous work for 20 years, and when she'd tried to share it, a man on a review board had taken it from her and sold it under a different name. She spent 30 years alone up there. His voice was low, even. The control of a man who had learned a long time ago that the space between feeling something and acting on it was where mistakes lived. Not because she was crazy, because she was right, and nobody cared. Nola didn't respond immediately. She placed her hand on the table near his, not touching, just close. The distance between their fingers was the width of a notebook. Somebody cares now. He gathered the documents, stacked them neatly, placed them inside the folder with the notebook, and the folder inside his jacket against his chest, where he carried the things that mattered. Outside, the truck sat at the curb. Gunnar was standing in the passenger seat, both front paws on the dash, his head turned toward the municipal building's front door. When Colton appeared, the dog's ears rotated forward and one shifted slightly to the side. A micro-adjustment, a single ear tracking a new frequency, as if he could read the change in Colton's posture from 50 feet away and was recalibrating accordingly. Yeah, Colton said, climbing in. It's what we thought. He turned the key. The engine caught. He pulled onto the main road heading north, back toward the ridge. 3 miles out of town, on the narrow stretch where the pavement turned to gravel, he checked the mirror. A dark SUV sat at the intersection behind them, engine idling, windows tinted. It hadn't been there when they'd arrived that morning. Gunnar's head swiveled toward the rear window. His ears went flat. His tail dropped. Slow, controlled, the measured descent of a dog whose body was moving from observation to assessment. Colton drove on. He didn't speed up. He didn't slow down. He memorized the plate number and the make and the way the vehicle sat on its suspension. Heavy, loaded, not a commuter car. "We've got company, buddy." Gunnar's eyes stayed on the mirror. Night settled over the ridge in layers, blue, then gray, then black, each shade deeper than the last until the only light was the quarter moon and the yellow glow from the kitchen window of the farmhouse. The trees stood motionless against the sky. An owl called from somewhere in the canopy and received no answer. Colton moved through the dark with a flashlight he kept pointed at the ground. He circled the barn first, checking the perimeter the way he'd checked 1,000 perimeters in a dozen countries. Not quickly, not casually, but with the systematic attention of a man whose survival had once depended on noticing a wire that didn't belong or a shadow that moved against the wind. He placed markers at each entry point. A thin branch balanced across the path between the house and the barn. If someone walked through it in the dark, they'd step on it, and the snap would carry in the stillness. A length of fishing line stretched across the barn's side door at shin height, tied to an empty tin can he'd found in the kitchen. Low-tech, field expedient, the kind of early warning system they'd taught at basic reconnaissance course, back when the enemies wore different clothes and carried different weapons, but used the same darkness. Gunnar moved beside him, circling the wider perimeter in a slow, deliberate patrol. 50 feet out, then back, then out again, his nose sampling the night air in short, rhythmic huffs. He stopped twice, once at the tree line behind the barn, where he stood motionless for 10 seconds before moving on. Once at the driveway, where he lowered his head and drew a long breath across the gravel, and then his tail descended slowly, leveling off horizontal. A signal Colton had seen before, in places where the scent on the ground told a different story than the silence in the air. Anything? The dog looked at him, then at the road, then back at Colton. Yeah. Noted. He didn't sleep in the truck that night. He didn't sleep in the house either. He sat on the floor of the kitchen with his back against the wall and the notebook in his jacket and the pry bar from the closet across his knees. The house creaked around him, the settling sounds of old timber adjusting to the temperature drop, a pattern of noise he cataloged and filed so that anything outside the pattern would register instantly. The refrigerator hummed. A branch scraped the upstairs window. The clock on the wall above the stove ticked with a regularity that would have driven most people to distraction. But Colton had spent 300 nights in observation posts, where the only company was a scope and a radio and the sound of his own breathing. And he had learned that silence wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of a pattern you trusted. Gunnar lay beside the back door, positioned across the threshold, so that any entry from outside would require stepping over 82 pounds of trained German Shepherd. The dog's eyes were half closed, his breathing even, but his ears rotated independently, left ear tracking the yard, right ear monitoring the hallway. A split attention that no human could replicate and no intruder would expect. At 4:17 in the morning, a sound. Not loud, not the snap of the branch across the path, or the rattle of the tin can on the fishing line. Something quieter and farther away. A creak from the barn, the kind of sound old buildings make when weight shifts on their floor. Subtle enough that a sleeping person would miss it, but neither of them was sleeping. Gunnar's head came up, his body reorganized. Not a gradual transition from rest to alert, but an instantaneous transformation, every muscle locking into place between one heartbeat and the next. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He stared at the back door with an intensity that turned his brown eyes nearly black, his ears pointing forward and slightly up, triangulating. Colton was on his feet before the thought fully formed. He crossed to the window and looked up the slope toward the barn. Nothing visible. No flashlight beam. No movement against the dark shape of the building. The quarter moon cast enough light to see the path, the slope, the outline of the doors, both still closed. Whoever was inside had not come through the front. He waited, counted to 60. At 30, Gunner's head shifted, tracking something Colton couldn't hear. A movement inside the barn that registered only in the dog's frequency range. At 45, the dog's body relaxed by 1 degree. At 60, Gunner looked at Colton and then at the door, and Colton read the signal. Gone. He didn't go out, not in the dark, not alone against someone who knew the property well enough to bypass 2 entry points and find a third that Colton hadn't secured. That was information, and information was worth more than confrontation. At dawn, he checked. The branch across the path was undisturbed. The fishing line was intact. But on the back side of the barn, a window he'd assumed was sealed, painted shut, glass intact, had been jimmied open. The paint along the sill was cracked, and fresh wood showed underneath. Someone had come prepared with a flathead tool and enough knowledge of the building to know which window gave. Inside the barn, in the cellar, the steel cabinet had been pried open. The lock hung from a single screw, its hasp bent outward. The cabinet was empty. Colton stood in the cellar and looked at the broken cabinet and felt nothing that resembled surprise. Because the documents weren't inside it. They were inside his jacket, where they'd been since the afternoon he'd opened the cabinet for the first time. Force Recon had taught him many things, and among them was this: never store what matters in the place where people expect to find it. Whoever had come in the night had risked a break-in for an empty box, and they would know now that the contents were elsewhere, which meant the next move wouldn't be a break-in. It would be something worse. He climbed the stairs back into the barn. The morning light fell in long shafts through the gaps in the timber walls. On the workbench near the window, something new. A county notice, folded once, weighed down by a rock that hadn't been there the day before. The intruder had left a calling card. He picked it up. The letterhead was official. Laurel Hollow County Code Enforcement. The text cited structural violations, compromised roof supports, inadequate egress, failure to maintain outbuildings to residential safety standards, a fine of $1,200, a 30-day compliance window. Structural violations. He set the notice down, looked at the barn around him. Old, yes. Worn, yes. But no more dangerous than it had been for the last 3 decades. The notice wasn't about safety. It was about a clock. 30 days to comply, or the county could condemn the building and clear the lot. And once the building was gone, the cellar would be exposed, the property devalued, and the sale to Vantage would become the only rational option. On the floor, near the barn's side entrance, boot prints in the dust. The same heavy tread he'd found after Pratt's visit. The same person. Back again. Colton crouched and studied the print. Size 11. Deep heel strike. Lateral wear on the outside edge. A man who walked with his weight shifted right. He filed it. Added it to the picture. Gunner stood in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun. His ears were up. His body was still. He looked at Colton, then at the boot prints, then at Colton again. "I know," Colton said. "They're not going to stop." The bell above the apothecary door chimed as Colton pushed it open. The morning light fell across the shop floor in a rectangle that reached halfway to the counter, and in that light, he saw the first wrong thing. The display case near the register was open. Tins of salve and balm that were normally arranged in neat rows had been shifted, pushed aside, not knocked over, as though someone had been looking behind them. A drawer beneath the counter was pulled out 2 inches. The cash register was undisturbed. Nola stood behind the counter. She was not wrapping herbs. She was standing still, both hands flat on the surface, watching Colton with the focused stillness of someone who'd been waiting. He was here. Who? Pratt. Half an hour ago. Walked in, browsed the shelves, picked up a bottle of arnica, brought it to the counter. She paused. Her voice was steady, but her hands on the counter were pressed hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Then he asked about you, what you'd found, whether you'd shown me anything from the property. He was smiling the entire time. Did he threaten you? He didn't need to. He bought the arnica, paid cash, told me I had a lovely shop and that it would be a shame if the landlord decided not to renew the lease. She looked at Colton. The landlord is county, and the county just sent you a structural violation notice. The connection landed without needing to be spoken. Pressure on the farm, pressure on the ally. 2 levers pulled by the same hand. He told her the rest. The break-in, the empty cabinet, the boot prints. She listened without interrupting, her hands still flat on the counter, her jaw tight. They're pressuring from both sides, legal and physical. Standard playbook. You pressure the property, pressure the owner, and if neither works, you wait for the 30-day clock to run out and let the county condemn the building. We need to go public. Colton didn't answer immediately. He leaned against the counter, his weight on his left arm, his right shoulder pulled tight against the old injury. Gunnar sat on the floor between them, his head turning from one to the other like a spectator at a conversation he couldn't join but understood better than either of them suspected. I came here to sell a farm, not to fight a pharmaceutical company. Then why haven't you left? The question hung in the air between them. Nola's eyes were steady on his. She wasn't challenging him. She was asking. And beneath the asking was something else. The implicit acknowledgement that she already knew the answer and was waiting for him to find it himself. Colton looked at his hands, broad across the knuckles, scarred along the left palm where a piece of shrapnel had opened the skin and helminth, and the field surgeon had closed it with 8 stitches and a joke about combat manicures. These hands had held a rifle for 16 years, and a dying man's collar for 30 seconds, and a woman's fingers in a hospital bed while her breathing slowed and stopped. They had held a dog's leash in a kennel at Camp Lejeune and felt the leather go tight when the dog chose him. And they had held a steering wheel for 14 months while the country outside the windshield changed and nothing inside the truck did. Nola reached across the counter and placed her hand on his forearm. Not his hand, his forearm. Above the wrist, below the elbow. The touch was light, deliberate. She held it for 3 seconds, and then she pulled back. He didn't pull away first. That was new. Under the counter, Gunnar lay flat on his side. His breathing had slowed. His eyes were closed. Mirroring. When Colton was still, the dog was still. When the room was quiet, the dog rested. Not because there was no danger, but because he trusted the two people above him to hold the line for the moment. I don't know how to stay somewhere. Colton's voice was low, directed at the floor, at the dog, at no one and everyone. She knew that about me. Elise. She knew before I did. Gunnar opened one eye, looked at Colton, lifted his front paw and placed it on Colton's boot. Not pressing, just resting there. The weight of it barely enough to register, and exactly enough to mean something. Yeah, buddy. I know. He pushed himself off the counter, straightened. The motion was slow, but when it finished, his shoulders were square and his jaw was set, and something in his posture had shifted from enduring to deciding. Make copies of everything. The notebook, the patent documents, the county records. Keep one set here. I keep one at the farm. If they come back to your shop, you tell them you don't know anything. They won't believe that. They don't need to believe it. They just need to hear it. He met her eyes. And Nola, the salve you make from your mother's plants, the one based on Evelyn's research, you said you've been testing it. Small batches, 4 people, all local. Inflammation, joint pain, chronic conditions. 2 weeks so far. Keep going, and keep records. Nola studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. And then? Then I need to find someone who was there when it happened. Someone who saw what they did to her. Earl Maddox lived at the end of a road that didn't have a name, in a single-story house with a metal roof and a yard full of things that had once been useful and were now rusting into the earth. A pickup truck with no tires sat on blocks near the tree line. A stack of firewood, cut but never split, leaned against the side of the house under a tarp that had torn free at one corner and flapped in the breeze. Colton parked the Silverado at the end of the gravel and sat for a moment, reading the property. The house was maintained, roof intact, gutters cleaned, windows unbroken. But the yard told a different story. A man who had stopped finishing things. A man who started tasks and then stood up and walked inside and didn't come back out. Gunnar jumped down from the passenger seat and walked to the front of the truck. He stood still, ears forward, reading the house the way Colton read it. For movement, for sound, for the particular quality of silence that meant someone was home and watching. The front door opened before Colton reached the porch. Earl Maddox was 71. Thin in a way that suggested meals skipped rather than diets followed, with white hair combed straight back and a face that had been outdoors for most of its life and showed every mile. He wore a flannel shirt buttoned to the collar and canvas pants and house slippers that made soft sounds on the porch boards. He looked at Colton, then at Gunnar, then back at Colton. I know who you are. Then you know why I'm here. Earl didn't invite him in. He stood on the porch with one hand on the doorframe and the other in his pocket, and he looked past Colton toward the tree line with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit for 15 years and had spent every one of those years hoping it wouldn't come. I was a lab technician with the Botanical Research Division. I worked with your grandmother for 8 years. I processed her samples, maintained her equipment, documented her results. I was there when she filed the patent, and I was there when they killed it. Tell me about Callahan. Earl's hand tightened on the doorframe. His knuckles went white, then released. Callahan came through as an external reviewer. First time, he was polite, asked questions, took notes, said he'd recommend approval. Second time, Earl stopped. His jaw worked. Second time, he came with a lawyer. Said the research had been conducted on federal time using federal resources, and any intellectual property generated belonged to the agency. Your grandmother told him the research predated her federal employment by 6 years. She had documentation. He didn't care. She called the sheriff. After the second visit, he hadn't threatened her outright, nothing she could file charges on. But she knew. She knew what he was going to do. Gunnar had left Colton's side. The dog walked up the porch steps, past Earl's legs, and lay down beside the old man's feet. Not at Colton's feet, at Earl's. He placed his head between his front paws and looked up at Earl Maddox with the calm, unhurried patience of an animal that had decided this person needed company more than the other one did. Earl looked down at the dog. His expression fractured for a moment, the hard lines around his mouth softening, his eyes going bright before he blinked it away. She had a dog just like this one. I know. Mr. Maddox, I'm not asking you to fight anyone. I'm not asking you to go to court or give a deposition or put your name on anything public. He waited until the old man's eyes met his. I'm asking you to tell the truth one time, to me, and to anyone in Laurel Hollow who wants to hear it. Earl stood very still. The breeze lifted the torn corner of the tarp against the house, and it flapped once, twice, then settled. I have something. He went inside. Colton heard a drawer open, papers shuffling, a drawer close. Earl returned with a single sheet of paper, yellowed, folded into thirds, soft at the creases. Internal memo, USDA Botanical Division. Dated 2 weeks after the patent rejection. It says, Dr. Voss's research was terminated for administrative convenience. He held out the paper. His hand trembled. Not from age, from the weight of holding something for 15 years and finally letting it go. Administrative convenience. That's what they called it when they stole a woman's life work and sent her up a mountain to disappear. Colton took the memo, read it, folded it into his jacket beside the notebook and the patent documents and the photograph he kept face down. Thank you. Earl looked down at Gunnar, still lying at his feet. There's one more thing you should know. Callahan didn't just sit on that review board. He visited her, personally, twice. The second time, she called the law. The sheriff came out, took a report, and nothing happened. His voice dropped. Then Callahan left the federal service, took a position at Vantage, and 6 months later, Vantage filed a patent that used her data. Colton stood on Earl Maddox's porch and looked out at the rusted truck and the unfinished firewood and the torn tarp flapping in the wind. A man who had watched it happen and carried the knowledge for 15 years in a house at the end of a road with no name. At his feet, Gunnar rose. The dog walked back down the steps, crossed the yard, and sat beside the Silverado's passenger door, facing the road, ears forward, ready. "We're going to fix this, Mr. Maddox." Earl didn't answer. He stood on the porch with his hand on the doorframe and watched the truck pull away. And when it was gone, he closed the door and sat down in his kitchen and placed both hands flat on the table and didn't move for a very long time. 3:14 in the morning. The farmhouse was dark. Gunner's bark split the silence like a rifle shot. One sound, sharp and absolute, fired from the back of his throat with a force that rattled the window pane above the kitchen sink. Not a warning bark, not the layered, modulated alarm he used for strangers at the door or animals in the yard. This was a single detonation of sound, the bark of a dog who had located a threat and was announcing it to the only person who mattered. Colton was on his feet before the echo died. He'd been sleeping on the kitchen floor again, boots on, jacket zipped, the notebook inside it. The pry bar was in his hand before his eyes were fully open. Orange light flickered against the kitchen ceiling. He crossed to the back window. The barn was burning. Not smoldering, not smoking. Burning. Flames climbing the north wall where the timber was driest, eating through the old wood with a sound like fabric tearing, fast and hot and getting faster. The fire had started at the base of the wall near the double doors, and it was climbing toward the tin roof with an appetite that old barns full of dry hay were designed to satisfy. "Go!" He pulled the back door open. Gunner was already through it. Colton ran up the slope. The heat hit him at 30 feet, a wall of it, dry and sharp, pressing against his face and hands. The double doors were engulfed. He circled to the side entrance, the one with the fishing line tripwire. The tripwire was gone. Cut, not broken. The side door was open. He pulled his shirt over his nose and stepped inside. The cellar stairs were 20 feet from the side door. The fire hadn't reached them yet, but the smoke had. Thick, gray-black, rolling along the ceiling in slow waves that dropped lower with every second. Visibility was 10 feet and shrinking. The heat pushed down from above, and the old timber crackled and groaned overhead, the joists shifting, the structure beginning to lose its argument with gravity. Gunner, here, now. The dog was ahead of him, already at the cellar stairs, already descending. "Gunner!" The sound of paws on stone, fast, then silence. Then, from below, a crash, glass breaking, a shelf collapsing. Colton reached the stairs. Smoke poured down the opening, drawn by the temperature differential between the burning barn and the cool cellar below. He couldn't see the bottom. He couldn't see the dog. "Gunner!" 15 seconds. The longest 15 seconds of Colton Voss's life. And he had lived through seconds in Helmand Province and the Euphrates River Valley, and a hospital room in Norfolk, where the seconds between one breath and the next had measured the distance between married and alone. Then movement at the base of the stairs, a shape in the smoke. Gunner came up those stone steps at a dead run, his head low, his body driving forward. And clamped in his jaws, held steady and level despite the smoke and the heat and the collapsing structure above him, was a tin box. Small, rectangular, sealed at the edges with electrical tape gone brown with age. He cleared the top of the stairs, blew past Colton, and didn't stop running until he was 30 feet from the barn on the open grass of the slope. He set the box down, sat behind it, and then he lifted his right front paw and held it in the air and didn't put it down. Colton dropped to his knees beside the dog. The smell hit him first. Singed fur, unmistakable, the acrid sweetness of keratin burning. A patch of Gunner's coat along his right flank was blackened and curled. The guard hairs melted into stiff, dark clumps. And his right front paw, the one he held in the air, was red along the pad. The skin blistered where he'd stepped on something hot in the cellar. Easy, easy. Let me see. Gunner didn't whimper. He didn't pull away. He held his paw out and let Colton take it, the same way he'd let handlers examine him after 100 training exercises and a dozen real operations. Still, trusting, enduring. Colton's hands were steady. They had been steady in field aid stations and in the back of helicopters and beside a hospital bed when steadiness was the only thing left he could offer. He pulled the first aid kit from his jacket pocket. Small, military grade, the kind he'd carried for so long it had become as much a part of his body as the scar on his side. He cleaned the pad with saline, applied burn cream, wrapped it in gauze, secured it with tape. Quick, efficient, gentle. You're okay, you hear me? You're okay. Gunner's tail moved once against the grass, slow, certain. Colton looked at the tin box on the ground. He picked it up, peeled off the tape. The lid came free with a soft pop, and inside, packed in cotton batting that had yellowed but held, were 6 glass vials, each one containing dried fungal specimens, each one labeled in Evelyn's handwriting. Original culture, batch 1 through 6, do not discard. The last of her research, the mother cultures, the source material from which everything in the notebooks had been grown and tested and documented over 30 years. Evelyn Voss had hidden the most important thing in the place where fire would reach last, and a dog would reach first. Behind them, the barn burned. The roof collapsed with a sound like a giant exhaling. Sparks rose into the dark sky and faded. The cellar would survive. Stone and concrete didn't burn. But the wooden structure above it was gone, and with it, the workbench and the shelves and the jars and the microscope and the decades of physical evidence that had filled that underground room. Colton sat on the grass beside his dog and watched the barn die. The notebook was in his jacket. The cultures were in the tin box on his lap. His dog was burned but breathing beside him, and the fire lit the slope in shifting orange. And somewhere below the ridge, the town of Laurel Hollow slept, without knowing that the largest crime in its history was collapsing into ash. Morning came gray and slow. Mist hung in the hollows between the ridges, and the air smelled of char and wet earth. Where the barn had stood, a rectangle of blackened timber and twisted tin lay steaming in the early light. The stone foundation remained, scorched, cracked in places, but standing. The cellar entrance, choked with debris, but intact. Everything above it, gone. Colton stood at the edge of the ruin. Gunnar sat beside him, favoring his bandaged paw. His weight shifted onto the other 3 legs. The burned patch on his flank was visible even from a distance. A dark blotch against the tan fur, the shape of a hand pressed flat. At 7:15, a silver sedan appeared on the dirt road. Different car than Pratt's rental. Darker, newer. It parked at the gate, and a man stepped out. He was not Gerald Pratt. Mercer Callahan was 55, tall, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead and a face that had been handsome once and now settled for authoritative. He wore a gray suit, not charcoal, not black, gray, the color of institutions and corner offices, and men who made decisions that other men carried out. His shoes were polished. His tie was blue. He carried nothing in his hands. He walked up the drive with the measured stride of someone who had been to this property before. Mr. Voss. The voice was calm, warm even. The voice of a man who had spent a career learning that the most effective way to control a conversation was to sound like you'd already won it. "I'm sorry about the fire. Old buildings in these mountains." He gestured at the ruin. "Terrible thing. The timber dries out. One spark and—" He shook his head. Sympathy. Rehearsed. Colton studied him. The suit. The shoes. Polished, but the soles were clean. Too clean for a man who just walked 30 yards up a muddy drive. He'd changed shoes in the car, or he'd been carried to the door, or he hadn't walked as far as he appeared to have walked. "You got here fast." "I was in the area, heard about the fire from a colleague, at 7 in the morning. Mercer smiled. It was a good smile, better than Pratt's. The smile of a man who'd had 30 more years to practice. "Vantage remains interested in this property, Mr. Voss. More than ever, perhaps. A fire like this, the demolition costs alone." "You've been here before." The smile held. "I've visited properties throughout this region. It's part of my—" "You visited my grandmother twice." Colton's voice was even, flat. The particular flatness of a man who is reciting facts, not making accusations. "The second time, she called the sheriff. That was you." The smile didn't drop. It reorganized. The warmth drained out of it, and what remained was structure, teeth, lips, the architecture of pleasantness without the substance. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. Stubborn, but remarkable." Gunnar had not moved from Colton's side, but his body had changed. The injured paw was forgotten. His ears were flat. His chest was low. His eyes tracked Mercer's hands and face and feet with the fixed, absolute attention of a dog who had identified something and was waiting for the command that would let him act on it. Mercer glanced down at the dog, at the bandaged paw, at the burned fur along his flank. "Your dog got lucky." He wasn't lucky. He knew where to go. Colton let the sentence sit. Let Mercer hear it. Let the space between them fill with everything that hadn't been said yet. Because someone taught him. Someone who knew what was worth saving in that barn and what wasn't. Mercer's eyes shifted, a micro-expression, there and gone, that crossed his face. Not fear, recognition. The recognition of a man who has just realized that the thing he came to destroy had already been removed. I don't know what you think you found, Mr. Voss, but I know exactly what I found. Colton reached into his jacket. Not the documents, not the notebook. He pulled out the tin box, opened it, held it out so Mercer could see the 6 glass vials inside, each one labeled in a dead woman's handwriting. She said no 15 years ago. She built a room underground and worked for 30 years alone because you stole what she'd built in the daylight. He closed the box, put it back inside his jacket against his chest, where the notebook already rested. The fire took the barn. It didn't take the research, and it didn't take me. Mercer stood in the morning mist, his gray suit darkening at the shoulders where the moisture gathered, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the muddy drive. He looked at Colton. He looked at the dog. He looked at the smoldering rectangle where 30 years of secrets had burned, and the secrets themselves had survived. You're making a mistake, Mr. Voss. I've made plenty. This isn't one of them. Mercer turned, walked back down the drive. The sedan door opened and closed. The engine started. The car backed onto the road and disappeared through the trees the same direction it had come. Colton stood at the edge of the ruin. Gunnar sat beside him, burned and bandaged and steady, his eyes still tracking the place where the car had been. They burned the building, buddy. He looked at the tin box inside his jacket, the notebook against his ribs, the dog at his side. They didn't burn what matters. Gunnar leaned his shoulder against Colton's leg, careful, favoring the injured side, but deliberate, present. The diner in Laurel Hollow seated 32 people. Colton counted the chairs on his first pass through the room, the way he'd once counted exits and sightlines and the distance between cover and open ground. 32 chairs, most of them mismatched, wooden ladder backs alongside vinyl cushioned seats that had been repaired with duct tape, all arranged around tables, pushed together in rows to create something resembling an assembly. It was Tuesday, 3 days after the fire. The smell of smoke still clung to his jacket, and Gunnar still limped on his right front paw. Lighter now, the bandage changed twice daily, the burn healing clean. But the dog moved with the careful, deliberate gait of an animal that had learned to redistribute its weight without complaint. The singed patch on his flank had begun to shed, revealing pink skin underneath that would scar, but not slow him down. Colton stood at the back of the diner near the kitchen door and watched people arrive. They came in ones and twos. The man from the bench outside the hardware store, still in overalls, still watching everything. A woman with 2 teenage boys who sat near the window and didn't take off their coats. The postman, still in uniform, carrying a cup from the gas station because the diner's coffee wasn't ready yet. A couple in their 70s, moving slowly, holding hands not for romance, but for balance. A farmer Colton had never spoken to, who nodded at him once and took a seat in the front row without a word. Nola had spent 2 days organizing this. Phone calls, handwritten notes slipped under doors, a conversation with the diner owner who'd agreed to close for the evening and donate the space. She stood near the front now, arranging papers on a folding table, the notebook, the patent documents, the county records, photocopied and collated into packets that she'd stapled herself at 2 in the morning while Colton sat on her porch with Gunner and said nothing and watched the street. By 6:15, the diner was full. 34 people, 2 more than the chairs could hold, so a man and his son stood against the wall near the jukebox. The room smelled like fryer oil and coffee and the dense human attention that accumulates when a small community gathers around a question none of them have asked out loud yet. Colton looked at Gunner. The dog sat beside the folding table at the front of the room, his bandaged paw extended slightly forward, his burned flank visible to anyone who looked. He wasn't performing. He was present. And his presence, the injured fur, the wrapped paw, the steady brown eyes that tracked the room without urgency, said more about what had happened on that ridge than any document on the table. I'm not much for speeches. The room quieted. Colton stood behind the folding table with his hands at his sides. He didn't grip the table edge, or shuffle his notes, or clear his throat. He stood still, and the stillness drew the silence the way a stone draws the current around it. My name is Colton Voss. My grandmother was Evelyn Voss. She lived on the North Ridge for 30 years, and most of you knew her better than I did. He paused, scanned the room, faces watching him, some curious, some cautious, some already skeptical. I came here to sell her farm. I'm not selling it. A murmur, small. The farmer in the front row uncrossed his arms. 3 days ago, someone burned her barn. My dog went in after something she'd hidden, and he came out burned. Before that, someone broke into the cellar she'd built under the barn floor. Before that, a man in a suit offered me 3 times the property's value and used my dead wife's name to pressure me into signing. The room was silent now. Not polite silence. The hard, focused silence of people who recognize when a story has shifted from interesting to personal. I found out why. My grandmother spent 30 years conducting research on a medicinal compound, a fungus that grows in the soil on these ridges. She documented its anti-inflammatory properties in notebooks that fill a shelf. She filed a patent with the federal government in 2009. That patent was rejected by a review board that included a man named Mercer Callahan. He picked up the photocopied patent documents and held them where the room could see. 3 years after rejecting my grandmother's work, Mercer Callahan's company, Vantage Biopharma, filed their own patent using her research, her data, her methodology, her compound. He set the documents down. They took what she built, and when she wouldn't sell the land where the evidence was buried, they waited for her to die. The room absorbed this. Colton could see it moving through the faces, not shock exactly, but the slow, dawning recognition of a pattern that had been visible all along to anyone who'd known where to look. Nola stepped forward. She was calm. Her voice carried the particular authority of someone who dealt in measurements and evidence and understood the difference between a claim and a fact. I've analyzed Dr. Voss's research notebooks independently. Her methodology is sound. The compound she documented, an endemic mycelium specific to these ridges, shows significant anti-inflammatory activity consistent with her recorded results. She looked at the room. I'm a pharmacist. I don't make claims I can't support. This research is real. A voice from the back. The farmer. Real enough for what? Nola glanced at Colton. He gave a small nod. Real enough that I've been testing it. She paused, letting the words settle. 2 weeks ago, with Colton's permission, I prepared a small batch of the compound using the original culture samples from Dr. Voss's cellar. I asked 4 people in this room, volunteers dealing with chronic inflammation, to try it, under my supervision, with their full knowledge of what it was and where it came from. She didn't need to call their names. They stood on their own. Martha Harlan was 67. She'd worked the register at the hardware store for 19 years, and for the last 8 of those years, she had not stood up from her stool without gripping the counter with both hands. She stood now. No counter, no cane, no hands bracing against anything. She stood in the middle of the diner with her shoulders back and her chin up, and her eyes bright with something that was either tears or fury or both. 8 years. Her voice was steady. 8 years I couldn't stand up without holding on to something. The VA gave me pills that made me sick. The clinic in Charleston gave me different pills that made me sicker. 2 weeks of what Nola gave me, and I'm standing here looking at you. Dale Duff was 73. He raised his right hand, the one that had curled into a permanent fist over the last decade, the fingers contracted by rheumatoid inflammation until they couldn't open past 45 degrees. He held his hand up and slowly, deliberately extended his fingers. Not all the way, not perfectly, but farther than they'd reached in years, the joints straightening with visible effort and visible success. Not a miracle, he said. His voice was rough, the voice of a man who didn't speak in public and was making an exception. But better than anything the VA gave me in 12 years. And that woman up on the ridge figured it out with a microscope and a garden. Claire Osborne stood last, 54. A teacher at the elementary school who'd stopped sleeping through the night 6 years ago because the pain in her hips woke her at 2 a.m. every morning without exception. I slept 7 hours last Thursday, first time since 2020. She looked at the room. Whatever Evelyn Voss was growing up there, it works. And somebody tried to burn it. The diner was quiet. Not empty quiet. Full quiet. The kind of silence that happens when 34 people are thinking the same thought, and none of them wants to be the first to say it. Then the front door opened. Mercer Callahan walked into the Laurel Hollow Diner at 6:42 p.m. He was not alone. A woman in a dark blazer followed him, younger, sharp-featured, carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than the diner's monthly rent. His lawyer. Mercer's eyes swept the room, took in the crowd, the folding table, the documents, the 3 people still standing, the dog with the bandaged paw. His expression didn't change. He walked to the front of the room with the measured confidence of a man who had entered hostile spaces before and believed that the right words in the right tone could diffuse anything. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. His voice was warm, calibrated, the voice of a keynote speaker, not a defendant. My name is Mercer Callahan. I'm Vice President of Regional Development at Vantage Biopharma Holdings, and I'm here because I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. He looked at Colton. Colton looked back. The documents Mr. Voss has presented are incomplete and misleading. The patent review process is complex. Administrative decisions are made for dozens of reasons: insufficient data, methodological concerns, commercial viability assessments. Dr. Voss's application was declined through standard channels. There was no theft. There was no conspiracy. His lawyer opened the portfolio and produced a stack of papers. We have documentation showing that Vantage's patent was developed through independent internal research. Any similarities to Dr. Voss's work are coincidental and reflect the shared scientific literature in the field. The room shifted. Colton could feel it, the subtle withdrawal of certainty that happens when someone in a suit says documentation and standard channels and independent research in a voice that sounds like authority. Half the room looked at the papers in the lawyer's hands, and then at the papers on the folding table, and wasn't sure which stack to believe. Mercer pressed the advantage. I'm going to request that the county review the legality of this gathering before any further claims are made. What's being presented here is anecdotal, unverified, and potentially defamatory. I urge everyone to... Mr. Callahan. The voice came from the back of the room. Earl Maddox stood beside the jukebox, his thin frame barely visible behind the man and his son who'd been leaning against the wall. He stepped forward. His hands were in his pockets. His face was pale, but his voice was clear. I worked for the USDA Botanical Division for 22 years. I was Dr. Voss's lab technician for 8 of them. I processed her samples. I maintained her equipment. I documented her results. He took another step forward. The room parted for him. And I was there when you came to visit her. Twice. I was in the next room during your second visit, when you told her that her research belonged to the agency and that she had no standing to file an independent patent. Mercer's smile remained, but it had frozen. A photograph of warmth with nothing alive behind it. Earl reached into his jacket and produced the yellowed memo. He held it up so the room could see the letterhead, the date, the official seal. This is an internal USDA memorandum dated 2 weeks after the patent rejection. It states that Dr. Voss's research was terminated for administrative convenience. His hand shook. His voice didn't. Administrative convenience. That's what you call it when you take a woman's life work, hand it to a private company, and send her up a mountain to disappear. The room turned. Colton felt it happen. Not gradually, not with deliberation, but the way a current changes when the river hits a bend. The faces that had been uncertain were now looking at Mercer Callahan with an expression that had nothing to do with documentation or standard channels. Mercer's lawyer whispered something. Mercer didn't respond. He was looking at Earl Maddox, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, his composure showed its seams. Colton stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. She said no 15 years ago. She built a room underground and kept working because that was the only place left where her research could survive. She grew the compound in soil that you tried to buy and couldn't. She documented everything in notebooks that your people tried to steal and failed. He paused. And when you couldn't buy it, steal it, or wait her out. You burned it. He looked at Gunnar. The dog sat beside the folding table, his bandaged paw extended, his burned flank visible under the diner's fluorescent lights. 82 pounds of evidence that didn't require a lawyer to interpret. My dog ran into that fire to save what your company tried to destroy. You want to tell these people it's not real? Martha Harlan spoke from where she stood. I'm signing whatever petition this man puts in front of me. Dale Duff nodded. Same. The farmer in the front row stood up, then the postman, then the couple in their 70s, rising together with the slow, synchronized effort of people who had been married long enough to move as one body. One by one, the diner stood. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough. More than enough. Nola set a sheet of paper on the folding table, a petition to the county board, requesting an investigation into Vantage Biopharma's land acquisition practices and a review of the patent timeline, and a temporary injunction against further property purchases on the North Ridge, pending review. The line formed without being asked. Mercer Callahan stood near the door with his lawyer and watched 26 people sign a piece of paper. His face was composed. His tie was straight. His shoes were clean. He left without speaking. After the last signature, after the diner had emptied and the tables had been pushed back into their usual positions and the coffee machine had been turned off, Colton stood on the sidewalk outside with Gunnar beside him. The street was dark. The church bell tower at the end of the block was lit by a single floodlight that turned its stone face amber against the night sky. Nola came out behind him, pulling on her jacket, the petition folder pressed against her chest. Your grandmother would have filled this room by herself. She did. Colton looked at the dark street, the closed shops, the town that had been sleeping when he'd arrived, and was now, for the first time in years, awake. She just needed 30 years and a stubborn grandson. Nola smiled. It was small, tired, real. And a dog. Gunnar's ears twitched. He looked at Nola, then at Colton, then at the truck. Ready. 3 weeks passed. The season turned fully into summer, and the ridges above Laurel Hollow went from the tentative green of late spring to the deep, saturated emerald of June. The air grew heavier, thick with moisture and the scent of black locust blossoms and warm earth. And the creek behind the farm ran higher than it had in months, fed by afternoon thunderstorms that rolled through the hollows and left the sky washed clean. The barn was gone. In its footprint, a rectangle of charred foundation stone and scorched earth, already softened at the edges where grass had begun to reclaim the perimeter. Colton had cleared the debris himself. 3 days of hauling blackened timber and twisted tin to a burn pile at the tree line, working in the early mornings before the heat set in, his shirt soaked through by 8 a.m., and his right shoulder grinding with every lift. He didn't complain about the shoulder. He hadn't complained about it in 20 years, and he wasn't going to start now. A new structure stood where the barn's side entrance had been. Smaller, simpler, built from rough-cut lumber donated by a sawmill operator on the South Ridge who'd attended the meeting at the diner and refused payment. A storage shed. Enough to cover the cellar entrance and house the tools Colton needed for the work that had replaced the work of selling. Because he was not selling. The herb garden had come back, not by itself, Nola had driven up 3 times in the first week with flats of seedlings from her own greenhouse and seeds she'd saved from Evelyn's dried specimens. They'd worked side by side in the mornings, kneeling in the dark soil between rows that Evelyn had laid out decades ago, planting into furrows that still held the shape of the old woman's design. Golden seal in the shaded rows, ginseng along the slope where the morning light hit first, reishi plugs driven into sections of oak log stacked at the garden's edge, inoculated from the original cultures that Gunnar had carried through the fire. Colton's hands were in the dirt most mornings now. Red Appalachian clay under his nails, in the creases of his palms, ground into the scar tissue on his left hand where the shrapnel had opened him up in Helmand. The dirt didn't wash out easily. He stopped trying. Gunnar's paw had healed. The pad had scarred into a smooth, shiny patch where the burn had been deepest, and the dog favored it occasionally on rough ground, shifting his weight with the unconscious adjustment of a body that had learned to compensate. The fur on his flank was growing back, shorter than the surrounding coat, a lighter shade of tan that caught the light differently. A mark, a story written on his body in a language anyone could read. He spent his mornings running the perimeter of the property in wide, unhurried loops, up the slope, across the ridge, down through the tree line, back to the garden where Colton worked. Each circuit took 12 minutes. Colton had timed it. The dog never varied the route. He ran it the way sentries walk a post, not because they expect to find something, but because the act of looking is itself a form of keeping. The county had opened a preliminary review into Vantage Biopharma's land acquisition practices in Laurel Hollow and the surrounding townships. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. It was paperwork and phone calls and a retired county attorney who'd agreed to represent the petition signers pro bono because his mother had known Evelyn Voss in the 1980s and had always said she was the only person on the North Ridge worth listening to. Mercer Callahan had been asked to provide documentation to the County Review Board. He had not been arrested. He had not been charged. He had hired a firm out of Richmond and was, according to the Laurel Hollow postman, who knew everything that passed through the mail, filing motions to dismiss. The fight was not over. It had changed shape, moved from a ridge in West Virginia to a conference table in a county office, but the pressure remained. Colton understood this. He had spent 16 years in places where winning a position didn't mean the position was safe. It meant you held it until the next push. On a Tuesday morning in mid-June, Colton was repairing the fence along the eastern boundary of the property, replacing rotten posts with new locust wood, digging holes in the clay with a post hole digger that Evelyn had owned for 30 years. And that still worked better than anything sold at the hardware store. His shirt was off. The sun hit the scar along his left side, a 12-inch line of raised tissue that ran from his lowest rib to his hip. The mark an IED in Helmand Province had left when it ended one deployment and started a long argument between his body and the word lucky. Gunnar lay in the shade of the fence line, his chin on his front paws, watching Colton work. Every few minutes, the dog would lift his head, check the tree line, check the road, check the sky, and then lower his chin again. Monitoring, not anxious, present. "You're supervising again." Gunnar's tail swept the grass once. Real helpful. The fence post sank into the hole. Colton tamped the clay around it with the back of the digger, tested it with both hands, nodded, moved to the next hole. His hands found the rhythm without thinking. Dig, set, tamp, test. The same hands that had assembled and disassembled an M4 carbine 10,000 times, that had applied tourniquets in dust and blood and noise, that had held a woman's fingers while her breathing stopped. He paused, leaned on the post-hole digger, looked at the garden, the rows of green already visible above the soil line, the reishi logs stacked in their oak frame cradle, the new shed with its raw lumber still pale against the charred foundation. He looked at the house, its porch still sagging on one side, its paint still peeling, its windows still cloudy with age. He looked at the road, the dirt track that led down through the trees to the town, and beyond the town to the interstate, and beyond the interstate to every other place he'd been in the 14 months since Elise had died. He could still go. The truck was parked in the yard. The keys were in his pocket. The road was open. He didn't go. The tractor shed, the old one that Evelyn had used for equipment storage, separate from the burned barn, still had a workbench along its back wall. Colton had cleaned it out the week after the fire, sweeping decades of cobwebs and mouse nests and rusted tools into a pile that he'd hauled to the burn site. What remained was a small, dry space with a tin roof and a concrete floor, and enough room for a man and a dog and the things that mattered. On the workbench, arranged with care, the 6 glass vials from the tin box, each one standing upright in a holder Nola had brought from the apothecary. Beside them, the notebook, closed, its leather cover beginning to dry and crack further at the corners. And beside the notebook, a black, leather-bound Bible, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, its pages gilt-edged and soft with age. He'd found it 3 days ago, not in the cellar. The cellar had been emptied of everything salvageable. He'd found it in the house, in the drawer of the nightstand beside Evelyn's bed, where it had sat undisturbed for 3 months while the property changed hands and the world moved on without noticing. He opened it now. The pages fell to a place they'd been opened to many times before. A crease in the spine, a slight darkening of the paper where fingers had rested. The Book of Psalms. And in the margin, in handwriting he now recognized as well as his own, a single line. Plant what matters. The soil remembers. Not a sermon. Not a commandment, a farmer's prayer, written by a woman who had spent her life putting things in the ground and trusting them to grow. He closed the Bible, set it on the shelf above the workbench, beside the notebook. 2 books, 2 records, one scientific, one spiritual, both written by the same hands, both kept in the same house. Both saying the same thing in different languages. He didn't pray. He wasn't sure he knew how anymore, or if he'd ever known. But he stood in that shed with the morning light coming through the open door, and the sound of the creek below the ridge, and the smell of turned earth from the garden. And for the first time in a very long time, he was still. Not the stillness of avoidance or of waiting for the next thing to go wrong. The stillness of standing in a place that had asked him to stay and choosing to answer. Gunnar appeared in the doorway. He'd completed his morning circuit. 12 minutes, same route, same steady pace. And now he stood in the light with his ears relaxed and his tail at half-mast, and his scarred right paw bearing weight without hesitation. "Hey, buddy." The dog walked to the workbench, sniffed the vials, sniffed the notebook, sniffed the Bible. Then he turned a circle on the concrete floor, once, twice, and lay down in the patch of sunlight near the door, curling into himself with a groan that was more commentary than complaint. You and me both. The last Saturday of June came in clear and warm. The sky above the ridges was the deep washed blue that only appears after a week of rain, and the air carried the smell of cut grass and wild mint, and the faint sweetness of black locust blossoms drifting down from the canopy. Colton stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, his one coffee of the day, taken standing, taken here, taken in the 10 minutes between the end of the morning chores and the start of whatever came next. The porch still sagged on the left side. He hadn't fixed it yet. There were things ahead of it on the list, and the list was long. And for the first time in 14 months, the list was not a burden. It was a direction. Gunnar lay beside him, stretched full length on the porch boards, his chin resting on the top step. His eyes were half open, tracking the road below, the garden to the left, the tree line above. The breeze ruffled the new growth fur on his flank, lighter than the rest, catching the morning sun. A truck appeared on the dirt road. Colton recognized it. Nola's white pickup, older than his Silverado, cleaner, with a toolbox in the bed and a flat of seedlings riding shotgun. She parked in the yard and stepped out, carrying the flat in one arm and a paper bag in the other. "I brought tomatoes." "I didn't ask for tomatoes." "You didn't ask for any of this." She set the flat on the porch rail and the bag beside it. "The county inspector is coming Monday. The shed passes code. The cellar's been documented. Nola Hargrove, licensed pharmacist, has filed an affidavit supporting the original research as legitimate and worthy of independent review." "You talk about yourself in the third person now?" "Only in legal documents." She leaned against the rail beside him, not touching, close. The distance between them had been closing by fractions since the night in the diner, not through grand gestures or declared intentions, but through the accumulated weight of mornings spent in the same dirt, evenings spent reviewing the same documents, and the particular closeness that develops between two people who have chosen the same fight for different reasons and discovered that the reasons don't matter as much as the choosing. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. The county wants to schedule a formal hearing. Vantage filed another motion to dismiss. It was denied. She put the phone away. "We're not done, but we're not losing." Colton looked at the garden, the rows of green, vivid against the dark soil, the reishi logs with their white mycelium blooming along the cut surfaces, the new shed, raw and plain, standing where a 30-year-old barn had burned and fallen and failed to take the truth with it. "What are you going to do with this place?" He'd heard the question before, from the lawyer in Charleston, from Pratt, from Nola herself, weeks ago, when the answer had been automatic and wrong. He looked at the garden, looked at the ridge, looked at the dog lying beside him on a porch that sagged on one side and held firm on the other. Keep it. Grow what she grew. Prove what she proved. He took a sip of coffee, set the mug on the rail. Maybe fix the porch. Maybe. Nola picked up the flat of tomato seedlings. These go in the south row. Full sun, good drainage. Your grandmother would have approved. She walked down the steps and across the yard toward the garden. Gunnar lifted his head, watched her go, then looked at Colton. One ear up, one relaxed. The expression of a dog who is waiting for a decision he already knew the answer to. Yeah, we're going. Colton set the mug inside the door, stepped off the porch. Gunnar rose, stretched, carefully, shifting weight off the scarred paw for just a moment before settling evenly on all four, and trotted ahead. Down the steps, across the yard, past the new shed, into the garden. He moved ahead of Colton by 10 feet, stopped, turned, looked back to confirm, then continued, leading. The garden stretched along the slope in neat rows, the soil dark and turned, the seedlings bright against the earth. Nola was already kneeling in the south row, her hands in the dirt, the tomato flat open beside her. Gunnar reached her first, circled once, and dropped into the grass between the rows, his body positioned where he could see the road, the house, and both of the people he'd decided were his. Colton knelt beside Nola, picked up a seedling, pressed it into the soil. His hands were steady. The dirt was warm. The sun hit the ridge at an angle that turned the garden gold, and the creek below silver, and the mountains beyond into a blue that went on as far as a man could see, and further than a man could walk. And the dog in the grass closed his eyes and rested in the light. And the woman beside him handed him another seedling without being asked. And the man who had come to sell everything his grandmother had built set it in the earth and pressed the soil down firm and didn't leave.